I'm your host, Damian Pardo, and today is a very, very special day for us. One thing you need to know about Forward Miami is that we're a local nonprofit. We work on diversity and inclusion, and we produce the Gay Ocho Festival in Little Havana and the Forward Gala. But today we have two incredibly special guests with a very hot topic, actually a topic that we've covered at the Gay Ocho Festival. It was an annual theme, and that's with gun violence. And I have Nadege Green, the editor of More Than What Happened, The Aftermath of Gun Violence in Miami, and poet contributor Arsimmer McCoy. Welcome to both of you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for
Hi,
having us.
thank you.
So I wanna talk a little bit about how we got here. I know this is an anthology and it's in three different sets, and it dealt with transit, sea level rise, and the last one is gun violence. Can we talk a little bit about that, how we got to gun violence and its impact in Miami?
Sure. The beautiful folks at O Miami reached out on the third anthology in this trilogy about Miami. And I remember there was a survey done, I believe it was by the Miami Herald, or certainly it was um, reported by the Miami Herald a couple years ago. And it was like, what are the most pressing issues in Miami? And one part of Miami said it was, I believe, traffic. And in predominantly Miami's Black communities and the lower income communities in Miami, it was gun violence. And so this huge difference, right, between how we perceive the communities we live in. And to be clear, gun violence is not just an issue in Black communities or low income communities in Miami-Dade, but we know that these are communities that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence. And while I was a reporter at WLRN, our local NPR affiliate, I started a series covering gun violence as a public health issue and covering gun violence from the perspective of community voices, not just as a crime story.
Yeah.
And so I thought that this would be a really good opportunity to build upon that work and to hand over, you know, the stories about Miami to Miami, right? Like, what does it mean to tell the stories about Miami from the communities that you don't typically hear when you hear things that are published about Miami? And I think gun violence is a very important topic, whether we're talking about the threats of gun violence at schools, in our malls, at football games, whether we're talking about the impact of gun violence from losing a loved one to gun violence, whether we're talking about intimate partner violence, because we know for women, disproportionately, if you are impacted by gun violence, it is intimate partner, domestic violence, right? And so all of the ways that this threads through our community and all of the ways that gun violence touches our communities, what would it mean to turn that over to our communities to speak on it? And that's exactly what happens in this book. Our youngest authors in this book are in elementary school, talking about how violence impacts them, right? And so also democratizing who gets to tell the stories about Miami. And so that Miami stories are not just written by a certain type of Miami, but that the vastness of Miami is reflected in the type of stories that are told about the space that we're in.
Those are great, great points. I know with Forward Miami, obviously, we do a lot of work in trying to bring South Florida together. And there's so many issues, and some that, that make it and some they don't. But even language, whether it's Spanish or Haitian Creole, if we don't even get to those folks to be able to, because gun violence is an issue, I'm certain in Hialeah, Opelika, a lot of other communities and Little Haiti. And, if we don't include as best as we can all the different parts of Miami in the storytelling, what you're doing is so powerful because there's nothing like storytelling. It's coming from the heart and lived experiences. And unfortunately, we don't have enough of that. I know we're saving a good at least 5 minutes for Arsimmer McCoy at the end to do a reading, which I'm really looking forward to. But I wanted to say that so people hang on and make sure that they're a part of it. I wanted to give you, Arsimmer, a little opportunity here as well to kind of comment on the book. And
The book is very bittersweet because this is 3 years I've been on pins and needles waiting for it to come out. Nadege is someone who has supported me very, very early in my career as a writer. I tried to act really cool the first time she told me she liked my poetry. I tried to pretend like I was cool about it, but inside I'm like, right? And so since that day, she has just poured into me. And so when this call came out, uh, I had a lot of mixed emotions because oftentimes we find that our trauma ends up as a joke to a lot of people. The traumas that happen in our communities, they end up in movies that our community doesn't get to spend time with, doesn't get to be involved with, and so I'm always cautious about telling personal stories and talking about personal narratives. But Nadege Green is someone who champions for our communities in every single way. And so having to sit with the amount of deaths that I just knew offhand from gun violence, whether it was on purpose, whether it was accidental, whether it was a relative or someone that I just knew from school, I realized just how affected I was and how unaffected I had become. And so I decided to, submit a piece just because I felt the numbness of just like, I knew all of these people, I know all of this is going on, and now I have a certain numbness towards gun violence and people dying. I sit sometimes and joke with my friends and say, like, if we hear gunshots in the community, I can tell you what type of gun it is by the sound. This is how connected we are to these atrocities, and also how disconnected we are. And so my piece is actually about a relative of mine who died at 3 years old, accidentally finding a gun and shooting herself.
I read
And
that.
it was difficult writing the piece, even more difficult. I go to my mama for everything, as we were discussing earlier, and her hearing the piece, remembering the funeral, remembering the tiny casket, remembering not knowing how to feel about the situation, realizing that everybody has a role that they played in this, and realizing that everybody has to stand up so that we never have to deal with these things again. And I know that sounds like a far-fetched dream for a lot of us, but I do believe it's creating work like this. It's creating this unification in artistry to help us understand just how affected we all are and how close in proximity we are to each other. And it's through art that we've been able to talk about it and make changes. So I appreciate Nadege for this project. But like I said, it was very bittersweet.
Well, I think when it hit home for me, and I guess you have to live it, or not that you have to live it, but you have to see the masses, because we collaborate with RJT Foundation with Denise Brown, and there's an annual event, people affected by gun violence, and it was an enormous room in the community filled with hundreds of people. Yeah, that doesn't happen where I live, for sure. And I think that's true for many folks. So how do you, other than through this artistry and through this body of work, how do you get to a place where you can talk about solutions for folks like me, who haven't lived it, but what do I need to do? Like,
It's interesting because I don't think you have to be in an area where gun violence is prevalent to be impacted by gun violence,
oh,
right?
sure, yeah,
Um, in Miami-Dade, for example, if you have a school-aged child who has to do code reds, you're impacted by gun violence, right? That
yeah,
our children have to run in closets and
yeah,
practice what it means if someone comes to shoot them up. And we have that in the book, that school age kids talk about trying to get homework done, trying to meet all of the benchmarks at school, but also having the anxiety of like, will I die at school today because there's a code red? And so also disrupting the narrative around what it means to be impacted by gun violence, because I think that there is a way that we can talk about this where it's like, well, it won't happen over here. Because certainly no matter what neighborhood you're living, if you're a woman in Miami-Dade County, you're not necessarily safe by the numbers, given
yeah,
that intimate partner violence does not matter where you live, right?
Mhm.
And so there are levels to gun violence. There's the neighborhood level gun violence, right? There is the gun violence that and the threats of gun violence, because we have been conditioned that our children might get killed at schools, that if you have school-age kids or school-age people that you love or have friends who are teachers, then you are impacted by gun violence.
Right.
If you've ever been to the mall and you heard a loud pop and everyone stopped, and there was a moment where they're like, "Do we run?"
Mm.
Because we know that there have been shootings near or at Aventura Mall, you have been impacted by gun violence in Aventura. So I think it's important that the narrative around gun violence is not people over here and then us over there, because that simply is not true.
Right.
Um, and if we want to talk about like the impacts of gun violence beyond the individual, that we have a network, right? A community of folks who love us, a community of folks around us. Gun violence is a public health issue. And so if you care about our hospitals, then you care about gun violence, right?
Right.
What does it mean? If you care about disability issues in Miami-Dade County, then you care about gun violence, because one of the things we don't talk enough about, which is also in the book, that most people who get shot survive. Many of the stories you see in the news are of people who heartbreakingly pass away, right? And those are the stories that tend to take up most of the news programs. However, because we have hospitals like Jackson Memorial, which is a level 1 trauma center, they keep people alive. So some 90% of people who get shot do not die. Nearly most of the people who get shot live. What does it mean to survive with a disability? What does it
Yeah.
mean to survive with now PTSD? What does it mean to survive and now have to retrofit your home to be wheelchair accessible or to have a caretaker, right? These are the stories we're talking about when we're talking about gun violence. And I think this book really shows a thread of both community survival, community love, and community togetherness. There's a story in the book that I wrote as a reporter. We reprinted some of my past reports from WLRN, where there is a support group run by Romania Dukes in South Miami-Dade of
Mhm.
parents who have lost loved ones to gun violence. One of those parents in the support group is actually a mom who lost her son at Pulse nightclub in Orlando. She lives in Pinecrest. She is the only non-Black woman in the support group, but when she needed to find support, right? Because her friends in Pinecrest didn't know what it was like to lose a child from gun violence. However, just a few miles down in Perrine and Goulds, a lot of Black mamas know what it's like to lose their children to gun violence. And so she found this community support system just down the street from her, in a way that if you have not lost a loved one, maybe you don't understand, right? The level of care, and the layers of grief and healing that happens over time, because as one mom told me, you never get over losing your child, right? And so we're also talking about community networks and how you create community support systems, even in the absence of institutional systems. We have a lot of institutional groups in Miami-Dade that does health work. There is no institutional group around gun violence, right? That
Good
provides
point.
sort of support, that provides a sort of therapy, and the ongoing mental health support that so many of the folks who experience gun violence need, even though we know this is a need in the community. And so it really is about connecting those stories around gun violence and the layers of that, that says that, we are all connected to this, even if you yourself have never been shot or necessarily live in a neighborhood where shootings happen. But we know that that in and of itself is not the only thread and connection to gun violence in our communities, sadly.
Yeah, no, and Nadege, you've done a great job of explaining how that threads all of us. In other words, of course, we are impacted in many different ways by gun violence. But I think, there are facts and then there are the way people feel about those facts. And I feel like a lot of folks don't feel it yet. They see it, yeah, they might be at the mall, something happened, it's horrible, stays in their mind a little while, and then, it's not. And so I guess what I was hoping is, to maybe have a roadmap of how as just regular folks can we, beside talking about it, posting about it, and participating in shows like this, how can we help? You,
Yeah. There are several anti-violence groups in Miami-Dade. You have the Circle of Brotherhood. They are also in the book,
Excellent.
The Hunger Nine. They actually held they had a protest against gun violence, right? Where they went without eating for days, right, to bring attention to this issue, but they are actively involved in anti-violence work, right? You have organizations and individuals as well. Many of the anti-violence work is on an individual level. And so you have people like Tangela Sears, right?
Mhm.
Who is
Yeah.
in the community and does anti-violence work. You have people like Romania Dukes, who is in the community and do anti-violence work. If you care about housing, housing can also be anti-violence work, right? What does it mean to not just have affordable housing, but safe housing,
Mhm.
right? Safe communities? And, even in the education sphere, right? What does it mean to educate around conflict resolution, right? Because that's anti-violence work that happens. And so I think those threads are there, and people are doing the work. It's just a matter of getting in touch with the folks doing the work, and also, being cognizant of the human stories behind what we're talking about here. Ultimately, I think what we're talking about is love, like an ethic of love, right? As Bell Hooks would say, right? So, what does it mean to truly love your community and not say,
Mhm.
we're over here and you're over there? But what does a love ethic look like in our community around the issue of gun violence? And how do you show up in that way?
Yeah, that's fantastic. We've had the good fortune of working with Leroy Jones, working with the folks at Circle of Brotherhood, and their work is fantastic. And I think that's a very good point. We've partnered with them on some initiatives, and I think if you're on the board of different groups, get to know these folks and get to know these groups that are doing anti-violence work. Arsimmer, I wanted to give you the opportunity to speak a little bit about what we've been chatting.
To be quite frank with you, Sister Nadege said everything that needed to be said. There were no crumbs left.
Nadege is very
uh,
complete.
this is like honestly, and you hit the nail on the head. And what I was, waiting to hear was love. Was like take the initiative. The fact that you already feel like there's something that needs to be done will thus lead you then to want to be educated. Will thus lead you to want to do the work. And we need more people to step up in non-black people, non-Hispanic people, people who don't have the connection, to say, you know what, I'm a teacher. I teach at this school. All my babies are different colors, and so I need to make sure all my babies are safe. I'm gonna start this initiative. I'm a pastor. My congregation is comprised of all different bodies. I'm gonna start this initiative. It starts with just that one piece of like, I need to step up and make the change. Because to be quite frank with you, Black and brown people are also exhausted with the education. We are constantly having to tell everyone, hey, this is what's happening here. Hey, hey, hey. We're screaming into the abyss sometimes. And
Yeah.
so at this point, we are just doing, we are moving, we are making the conscious decision that we are going to save us. And so all we need is for people to step up and say, hey, I see you. What can I
Mhm.
do? Like you said today. But really taking the initiative and making big steps towards
Mhm.
making the changes. But
Yeah.
Nadege always knows what to say, always knows what we need to hear, what the people need to hear. And so I don't need nothing else to say.
Yeah. I know there was one statistic, we ran it on our screens at the Gay Ocho Festival about the number of kids that are killed due to gun violence, and it was something like 250, something in that range. Nadege, can you speak to, like, little kids getting I mean, that just blew my mind. How,
Yeah, we lose a number of school age kids to gun violence in Miami-Dade every single year. Um, and what strikes me also is like which kids we pay attention to, because you mentioned little kids, right? Definitely the stories of a 3-year-old, in the case of King Carter, many of us know his story, a 6-year-old killed. People pay close attention because they're like, "Those babies should not have been killed." Like, how does
yeah,
this happen to
no
a baby?
babies should be killed, you
But
know?
a 16-year-old is still a child. A
Yeah.
17-year-old is still a child. And once we get to the 16-year-olds and the 17-year-olds, it becomes, what did this child do to get themselves killed? And
Mm,
so I often hear from the mothers who lose teenagers to gun violence, how the lack of care and empathy is simply not there for them in the same way because they had a 16-year-old boy who was killed. And it becomes, well, what did he do? Or what was he into? And this is still a child.
Yeah,
right?
of course.
This is still a
A
child
human. I mean, no human,
who gets executed in the streets of Miami, and we ask, well, what did this child do, as opposed to why did this child have to die, right? Like, and so really interrogating where empathy lies, right? Like, who do we really care about, and who are we okay with not being here anymore because we have these preconceived notions
That's
around.
such a good point. That is such a good point. That's so true.
And so I think again, like what this book does is really it puts it in front of you, right? And I put this in the foreword that this is not light reading. This isn't a book that I would encourage you to read from front to back. I mean, it gets heavy, and sometimes you're going to want to put it down. You're going to have to put it down. But what this book is about witnessing, right? If you've ever been to a Black church, or if you grew up Pentecostal and you witness, right? You tell your story. But this is also about memory. This is about remembering, those we lost and those who are still with us. This is a book about grief, how we grieve, how we remember, and what we remember, right? It's a book about love. We have many photo essays in this book of photographers who come from Liberty City, Overtown, um, and in Little Haiti, and they talk about growing up in their neighborhoods and loving their neighborhoods, and who gets to have guns. Like Aaron Jackson, Liberty City photographer, said, "My
Mhm.
grandma had a revolver." Like, so and so our relationship around that, right? Because there are many grandmas who have guns too, right?
Mhm.
Like that, um, and so just uplifting the different ways when we talk about gun violence. In fact, I have to talk about Miami Norland students. There are at least a dozen essays from students from Miami Norland High School, who had Precious Simonet, who was an English teacher there, as their teacher. And their work was just so brilliant. I just created a section with their work because they were also among the first, the only in the book, who also connect police violence as gun violence, and how many children consider young Black boys who get shot by the police and how they perceive that as a type of gun violence and a threat to their lives as well, right? And what does it mean to be in a neighborhood with a hoodie? And am I safe, not from my neighborhood or from some unknown person, but am I safe from the people who are supposed to protect us? And so they also interrogate that. And so, like, again, it really pulls back the layers around how our community members, how our neighbors think about gun violence, how they are impacted by gun violence, and what they have to say about it.
No, those are great points. And I know Circle of Brotherhood does a lot of work with police and with education and training. And so those are all very, very good points. I did want to leave this space so that Arsimmer, you can go ahead and do the reading, which I read and is incredibly impactful.
Thank you. And thank you for this conversation. Once again, Nadege, thank you for this opportunity to be a part of this work. It's brilliant, it's thoughtful, it's what we needed. And thank you, Damian, as well.
Pleasure.
Still got that ringing in my ear. The romance is in the aftermath. A collage of photos heat pressed on white shirts, Black hands collapsed into one another, linked around and under a green tent. Shoes sinking into a blanket of artificial grass, a baby cries during the prayer. Breaking the thin layer between decorum and hysteria, mama collapses in her sister's arms. The little ones look to the elders for reassurance they won't be next. No one would ever lie to a Black child like that. This ain't Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy or equal opportunity. This ain't bubblegum trees coming out your head. This is death. This is a dance we do every time we walk outside, a sidestep with what if and maybe right now. One shot rang out, one shot rang out, one shot rang out. I imagine it was the shine of the handle, the way it looked playful and heavy at the same time, or it may have been how it was discussed but never seen. But there it was, unboxed and unattended, like the many gadgets that decorated her little room. One shot rang out, 4-year-old Sade looked down the barrel to see if there was a jack in the box inside. One shot rang out. One shot got her little finger caught in the trigger, used her chin and chest to pull it out. One shot, her Disney World t-shirt was the top that she had on. It stopped up the blood around her neck, which gave little to the floor and more to her father's arms. He got to her first, pushed her mother out the door and locked it. Her screams are still stuck in the walls. Nobody slept in that house until the funeral, because when they did, nightmares of a curious baby sneaking away from the kitchen to go play alone entered into their heads. Best to create a romance. Cliche conversations about the Lord's will, about being still, but not about how a gun gives you a license to kill, even if you're four, and it's yourself. Thank you. This is in honor of Deja McCoy, born 2005, died 2009 at 3 years old.
Wow. I'm just so sorry.
She lives. Thank you.
I'm going to just give stats of where they can find you with Miami Book Fair. I was wondering if you ladies had anything else in closing that you would like to say before I close with where they can find you.
Arsimmer McCoy _Arsimmer on Instagram. I'm going to be with Nadege.
Well, listen, there will be a reading at the Miami Book Fair, and we thank our partners, the Miami Book Fair, Saturday, November 19th. So please mark your calendars. Saturday, November 19th, 12:30 p.m., and it's room 8301. Joining Arsimmer McCoy will be Weber Charles, LaBetsy Charan, I'm sorry. Correct me if I say these names wrong. It's Darius Daughtry, right. Darius Daughtry and Tania Dixon. Thank you very much, ladies. Appreciate you joining us. And to all our viewers, we look forward to seeing you next week on Forward Miami Live.